All right, Sagar, what's on your radar?
Well, a story I've done my best to track since the very beginning of the pandemic is the lab leak hypothesis. Why? Not because it's a dunk on China necessarily, but because its treatment reveals how the culture war in America today corrupts basic facts. It poisons the ability of our media and the elite class to do basic reasoning. And because the more you dig, you realize if the lab leak hypothesis is in fact true, we have learned nothing from this horrific event and are probably even more at risk of another one in the future. A new entrant onto the scene of reporting out the lab leak hypothesis was introduced. Stunning new facts, and it puts the mainstream media to shame. It gives even more credence to the theory. Nicholas Wade, he's a former science correspondent for the New York Times, out with a bombshell new multi-thousand word study for the Bureau of Atomic Scientists, in which he does what I consider to be the best job so far of investigating the origins of the outbreak. If you don't know the broad contours of the lab leak theory, let me lay it out for you. We know coronavirus came from Wuhan, China, where there happens to be a lab called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That lab was conducting a type of research known as gain-of-function research, where scientists attempt to create viruses which are more powerful than known in nature, the theory being that you can then create cures for potential diseases of the future. That type of research is incredibly risky, so much so it was banned for a time by the US government under the Obama administration. But what we now know is Dr. Anthony Fauci, the so-called hero of the pandemic himself, is the chief proponent of gain-of-function research within the US government. So much so, he worked within the Trump administration to overturn that ban while nobody was looking in 2017. We now also know with certainty the U.S. government, under Fauci, funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab into bat coronaviruses. We also know that the very people charged with investigating whether coronavirus leaked from the lab are those that facilitated funding of the type of research itself. In short, it's not about blaming China. If anything, if coronavirus did leak from a lab, it is the biggest indictment of the public health establishment in America, that we knowingly have been funding dangerous research in places with substandard safety protocols, which may have caused the worst pandemic in nearly a century. Okay, so you're with me. Here is where Nicholas Wade comes in with some stunning new reporting and analysis, which dramatically indicts American authorities. Wade lays out how the NIH and the NIAID funneled dollars to gain-of-function research in Wuhan despite a U.S. government ban. That this funneling occurred specifically because Dr. Fauci or Dr. Francis Collins, or possibly both, overruled U.S. government policy through an exemption loophole. And Wade quotes an expert who says both of these officials, quote, have systematically thwarted efforts by the White House, Congress, scientists, and science policy specialists to regulate gain-of-function research of concern. In other words, Fauci, the hero of the pandemic, was intimately involved in funding and perpetuating the research that very likely is what caused this entire thing in the first place. And the cover-up here really is stunning. I'm sure all of you are again wondering why you need to listen to a guy on YouTube like me or Joe Rogan read this type of article in a non-mainstream source just to get the most basic facts about probably one of the most important stories of the century. It's on that question, too, where Wade shines, writing, quote, "To my knowledge, no major newspaper or TV network has yet provided readers with an in-depth news story of the lab escape scenario, which the one you have just read. Worse, he lays out how in the world of science reporting, journalists are usually not skeptical of the claims of their sources, like one may be in political reporting, that this was very cynically exploited by the very scientists who may be responsible for this entire thing. But the real reason is one that we all know. The reason the media didn't do any of this is because Trump said it was real back in March. And look, he didn't do it because he knew it was for certain. He did it because he wanted to avoid blame. But just to avoid giving him even an ounce of credit, they refused to do this investigation and unwittingly have become useful idiots for a multi-million-dollar industry which is cooking up dangerous viruses under the guise of keeping us all safe. Will they correct their mistakes? You already know the answer. Journalist Michael Tracy, he went back. He messaged some of these journalists from the Washington Post, New York Times, the Daily Beast, Huffington Post, Kaiser Family Foundation, many more, on whether they would update or correct their stories in light of all this new evidence. Not one responded to him. Why does all this matter? Can't we just say, move on, you might say? No, because if the media refuses to do its job, this can all happen all over again. And it already is. In response to the pandemic, scientists have now cooked up a $1.2 billion scheme known as the Global Virome Project, which is a, quote, 10-year collaborative scientific initiative to discover unknown zoonotic viral threats and stop future pandemics. In other words, it's $1 billion more thrown at gain-of-function research for a whole host of new unknown viruses. Who will do the investigation into whether any of this is safe? Will Congress come to its senses and say, hell no, we're not allowing that here? And if the U.S. government or U.S. taxpayers are trying to fund it, then maybe we should ban it. Answering the question as to the origin of the coronavirus is the only way that we can determine what is and what is not safe in the future. And unfortunately, our media has doomed us to a possible round 2, and we only hope that the next one is not as bad as this one was. It's a pretty stunning piece, Crystal, that you first of all have to read Nicholas Wade in the Bureau of Atomic Scientists. Excuse me, multi-thousand word piece. Once again, he goes through the investigation. I didn't want to quote all of it because it's incredibly long, but talking to some of the world's top virologists who said the moment that they saw it under a microscope, he was like, I knew this came from a lab. He was like, there's no way that this came naturally. And even the natural hypothesis, the Chinese have yet to find the bat that flew like 1,000 miles and happened to bite this thing, which then jumped to, something else and somehow had a human thing. Who's patient zero? Still, none of that has ever come out on this. And it's all just been very quietly quashed. And I think the thing, again, I want to emphasize, not about China, it's not about Trump, any of that. If this came from gain-of-function research, we should probably not do $1.2 billion more of gain-of-function research.
Well, one of the things he points out, too, that I didn't realize is how routinely these viruses that they're manipulating through gain-of-function research are escaping the lab. It happens every year. So the idea that this came from a lab is not crazy or improbable at all, because documented other viruses escape the lab, again, almost every single year while doing this research. He also goes through not only the improbability of it having come from a bat, also, and this is another thing I didn't know, previous viruses that did jump from wildlife into the human population, they were able to track that back.
Easily, very easily.
Very easily and very quickly. So they knew right away, like, oh, here was the evolution. It went from this animal to that animal, and that's how it ended up here, and that's where we ended up.
SARS and MERS.
Exactly. So the other piece, though, that to me was really key in understanding the dynamics of all of this is there were essentially 2 letters that came out in the beginning that were like, it's absolutely not from the lab. And a bunch of scientists signed on to this, and this is what the media took and ran with. And that's why they always, when they're talking about this, they're like, the debunked lab leak hypothesis is essentially tracked back to these 2 letters. And he goes through how, in particular, the very first letter, the person who was leading the charge deeply compromised.
Is Peter Daszak, who is, again, this is the person who facilitated the funding from the NIH to the Wuhan lab and is now on the Wuhan team investigating for the WHO.
So this guy is directly, if it came from the lab, he's directly implicated in being involved with securing the funding for this. Now, not only does he spearhead this letter saying, oh, it's absolutely not that, with zero disclosure that he has any conflict of interest here. But as you said, he's also on the World Health Organization team that's investigating where this came from. So look, scientists are human beings. They are looking out for their own interests in the way that human beings do. And there's a lot of money and careers and research to be had from going down, in this direction of this gain-of-function research. This is how people make their career. So they're ambitious, they want to protect themselves, and there is a lot of money at stake if this type of research gets exposed as dangerous as we see that it is, and is ultimately shut down. So they closed ranks. Media just accepted it, not only because they just were sort of like deferential to the scientists, trust the science, but also that was part of it. The other part of it was Trump out there acting as a bad actor. And of course, his acolytes taking it too far and saying like this was intentional, China releasing it. Oh, that's not what we're talking about here at all. But that's part of why they immediately shut this down. And just the investigation of what actually happened became this weird partisan issue.
Yeah, and even now it's partisan, which is that right now only Republicans are the ones who are talking about it. Why? Because they hate Fauci. And look, I don't like Fauci, but that doesn't mean that this should be the impetus of the investigation. It should be Fauci, Dr. Peter Daszak. It should be anybody who was involved in funding gain of function. But more importantly, $1.2 billion thrown, 10 times more money thrown at gain of function research in response to the pandemic is possibly the worst thing you could do if gain of function research is what created this virus in the first place. And that is possibly what I'm scared the most about, from the investigation into all of this. I encourage you all to go read Nicholas Wade's reporting. It'll take you a while, but it is very, very worth just going through systematically debunking some of the other hypotheses, really investigating everything. This is the type of work we should have had back in May of 2020, but we had to wait till 2021.
And if you want to avoid the next pandemic, we should really, really understand. That's the other thing that comes out of this piece, why it's so important to understand what happened here.
That's right. All right, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.